6. O'Hara smiled as he refilled Stephanie's glass. She picked it up with a steady hand and sipped. The bourbon was sweet and warming now. At first, it had tasted bad, strong and poisonous with a flavour of rot and vomit. But that had just been her stomach complaining after the helicopter ride. The helicopter ride and all the anxiety. I'm sorry if you felt pressured by the way you were brought here, Stephanie. O'Hara moved away from her to refill Mulray's glass, then returned to sit beside her on the long black silk couch. Mulray grinned and saluted Stephanie with his glass before he drank. Stephanie didn't smile back. You see, said O'Hara, I knew almost immediately when Mr. Mulray went into the company computers and began to snoop, said Mulray. Let's say, began to study the corporate structure of the Butler Institute. Of course, the company could have punished him, but he was a promising young employee, and I like to think that I am a good man-manager. O'Hara wasn't looking directly at Stephanie as he spoke. He was staring thoughtfully out the wide, dark window of his living room. The sun was rising over the tree line, and in the gaps between the conifers you could see the distant yellow shapes of the excavation machinery beginning to move back and forth to the tunnel mouth as the working day began. I've always favoured the carrot instead of the stick, said O'Hara. Reward instead of punishment. So, I not only offered Mr. Mulray a promotion, I also explained about the Institute's latest and biggest project. O'Hara turned and looked into Stephanie's eyes, smiling. I let him into the secret. Stephanie smiled right back. And now you're going to let me in on it too? There was a small noise from the doorway of the living room, and Stephanie instantly turned towards it. She saw Mulray move as well, coming out of his chair and reaching under his jacket, then stopping when O'Hara raised his hand. It's all right, said O'Hara, getting up off the couch and walking through the doorway to the kitchen. He came back carrying a little boy, swinging him through the air and laughing. A spy, said O'Hara. He sat down on the couch again, putting the boy on his lap. This is my son Patrick. Patrick, this is Mr. Mulray and Stephanie. We've met, said Stephanie, solemnly shaking hands with the child and smiling at him. All of them were smiling, except the little boy. Of course you have. Stephanie looked after you at the office yesterday, Patrick. I remember, said the little boy. Where was I? Said O'Hara. The project. Well, it's a big idea and a big challenge, but we live in times that offer big challenges. The little boy settled comfortably in his father's lap as he spoke. Challenges of survival. In this world, health is rapidly becoming the most precious commodity. Forget gold or oil or data, forget about water. None of those things are any good if we don't remain alive to use them. O'Hara gestured with his hands as he spoke, lifting them up, then letting them settle back on the shoulders of his son. Patrick caught hold of one and gripped it in his own small hand. Stephanie, both you and Mr. Mulray are familiar with our use of surgery and transplants to maintain health. But do you know how difficult it is to find good stock? That's because the environment is increasingly compromised. We are poisoning the planet we live on. For decades we've known the dangers, and for decades we've insisted on doing nothing. Now, our information gatherers bring us the inevitable news. We are reaching the point of no return. O'Hara paused and took a sip of orange juice, offering the glass to his son afterwards. But the Butler Institute is taking action. We have the solution. The boy drank the rest of the juice and then stared solemnly up into his father's face. It's quite a simple solution. A bright child can grasp the basic concept. O'Hara took the empty glass from his son. Go on, Patrick. Explain the project to Stephanie. The little boy looked across at Stephanie. He was a solemn, quiet child, taking after his mother in looks and mannerisms. Stephanie had met Mrs. O'Hara a few times at company parties. Anne Marie O'Hara had been trained as a mathematician, but she abandoned research to study music. She had apparently been some kind of child prodigy. Daddy says that we live in our thoughts, said the little boy, speaking slowly. We have arms and legs and bodies, but really it's all up here. He touched his head, small fingers in his fine pale hair. So it doesn't matter if our arms and legs and bodies die, just so long as we can make our thoughts stay alive. And Daddy says that our thoughts are just patterns in our heads, and that we can copy those patterns just the way I sampled Jack Blood off the television. Giving me quite a shock too, I can tell you, said O'Hara, chuckling. Stephanie and Mulray both laughed immediately. Stephanie opened her mouth, but Mulray was already speaking. Clever kid, he said. That's very good, Patrick, said O'Hara. Go on. The little boy shifted awkwardly, embarrassed by the attention and the praise. Daddy says we'll copy the patterns into computers, the patterns of our thoughts. Then our thoughts will be alive on the computers, and the computers will last forever, and we'll live inside them. It won't matter what the world is like outside, what the pollution. It won't matter what the pollution is like, or the ozone layer, or anything, because we'll be safe inside machines. The boy wrinkled his forehead. No, he said slowly. That's not right exactly. We aren't just going to be inside the machines. We are going to be the machines. What a smart little guy, said Mulray, again getting there a fraction of a second before Stephanie. But our bodies will be dead, though, said Patrick. For the first time he looked at his father with something like uncertainty. For a second there was silence. Stephanie could see that Mulray was trying, but he couldn't think of anything to say. She made her move. She slid across the couch, moving her body against O'Hara's, reaching across him and picking up the little boy before anyone could protest. She swung Patrick up in her arms. The boy was a lot heavier than she'd imagined, and she could feel him stiffening in her grasp, reacting to her uncertainty. Stephanie pushed her shoulders back, taking the weight of the little boy on her breasts, his head beside her face. As she adjusted her grip, the boy relaxed, and Stephanie felt a flash of triumph. You are a smart little guy, very, very smart, she said, holding him tight and carefully resting his small head on her shoulder. She turned around, carrying the little boy with confidence now, and looked at Mulray sitting in his armchair. He wasn't saying anything. Stephanie squeezed the little boy tight. She'd read that children liked to be hugged and touched a lot. Brave too, said O'Hara. He'd got up from the couch and now leant over, ruffling the little boy's hair. Stephanie felt a flush of triumph. To touch his son, O'Hara had to stand close to her, almost touching. She turned so that the boy was face to face with his father. They were like a media image of a healthy, beautiful family. Big and brave, said O'Hara, tousling Patrick's hair. Tell Stephanie the rest of it. There's more, said Stephanie, looking at the little boy with mock wonder. The boy said nothing, and the living room was silent. The distant sound of machinery could be heard through the picture window, beyond the trees down at the excavation site. The next part of our project involves kids, and you'll never guess what, said O'Hara softly. Now Mulray's head snapped up, and he looked at O'Hara. He made a sound as if he was about to say something, but he remained silent. Patrick's volunteered for the experiment, said O'Hara. Way to go, little guy, said Stephanie. She aimed her widest, whitest, most stunning smile at the little boy, but he was looking thoughtfully at his father. A little guy with a lot of guts, she said. Mulray had got out of his armchair, and he was standing up now, looking at them. The boy looked at Stephanie, then over at Mulray. The boy and the man stared across the room at each other for a moment, and then Mulray abruptly turned and walked out. Stephanie watched him go down the stairs towards the kitchen. O'Hara opened his arms, offering to take the boy from Stephanie. She handed Patrick to his father. Excuse me a second, she said. Of course, said O'Hara, taking the child and kissing him on the forehead. Stephanie went out of the sitting room and down the pine stairs. In the kitchen, Mulray was standing at the sink, holding a glass under the big snout of the taps. Water hissed out through the filter. He drank a glass, refilled it, and drank again. When he turned to Stephanie, his mouth was wet and his face was an odd colour. Yellowish. Stephanie thought it was an interesting colour. We can call Albany from here, said Mulray. Why would we want to do that? Look, the man's clearly Looney Tunes. So is his project, for that matter. Fine, I'm happy to go along with it. He's the boss. And I've done some fairly hairy stuff in my time. It's been my job. I'm really happy to provide third world garbage for biostock. There are people who need that blood and those bodies. They're spare parts for real Americans. Real people. That's my job and I'm good at it. Mulray set the glass back in the sink and wiped his hands. But all that stuff about that little boy volunteering for the experiment? You know what that means? He's talking about killing the kid. Yes, said Stephanie. We can't just let that happen. No, said Stephanie. Mulray was looking at her now. It was as if it was the first time he'd ever really looked at her. Stephanie liked the thought. Mulray was taking a good look at her now. Mulray went back to the sink and picked up the towel again. He wiped his hands again, although they were already dry. He kept looking at Stephanie, rubbing his hands nervously with the towel. In the surgical fluorescent light of the kitchen, she could see the lines around Mulray's eyes. The lines he had when he smiled, although he wasn't smiling now. The lines made him look old and tired. Stephanie liked those lines. Surprise, she said. O'Hara was still sitting on the couch with his son when she went back into the living room. The B&O home entertainment system was on, and the little boy was watching Saturday morning television. What's on, Patrick? The little boy answered without looking away from the screen. Just some kids' stuff, but Jack Blood is going to start in a minute. That's nice, said Stephanie, settling herself on the couch beside O'Hara. Mulray is secure, she said. That's good. I had my doubts about him. He'll work out fine. I'll see to that. You've clearly handled it very well, Stephanie. You're going to be exactly the right person for this project. Stephanie's face flushed at the praise. It was going red. Stephanie knew it was. She hoped O'Hara wouldn't notice in the television light. Her body felt sweaty with the relief of a job well done and with the warmth of the praise. Time for Jack Blood, said Patrick. He touched a button on the remote control and the software in the B&O changed channels for him. 2 small lights flashed on the slim dark boxes of the home entertainment centre. One small light indicated that the television receiver was active. The other one showed that the communications system was currently transmitting. A discrete camera and microphone scanned the interior of the living room. It observed every move made by the 3 people watching television on the couch. It heard every word they said. This information was then routed by optical cables down to the transmission masts by the excavation further down the mountain slope. From there, the sounds and images were fired up to a satellite leased by Northern Global and relayed onto the European Community Data Network. Coded packets of data were passed along, read and readdressed, then passed along again. Their ultimate destination was in southern England. There, the signal was picked up by a satellite dish lashed onto an ornamental spire on top of a Victorian greenhouse. The big glass structure stood in overgrown gardens that gave way to broad grounds with long grass and shrubs that had gone wild. The grounds ran up into a slope thickly wooded with old fruit trees. A broken wall ran around the perimeter of the grounds, paralleling a loop of gravel drive that wound up towards the red brick house and the long, low building hidden beyond the greenhouse. It was morning in New York State, but afternoon here in England. Rain was falling from a luminous grey sky, and the wild garden looked lushly green. Thunder rolled in the distance beyond banked yellow clouds. A small cat broke from shelter near the greenhouse and ran towards the long building that had once housed stables. The cat didn't like getting wet, and it darted through the long grass on the lawn. There was a fresh scar of turned earth running between the greenhouse and the stables, and the cat ran along beside this muddy line. Buried here, under the lawn, was a long bundle of cabling, mixed copper wire and optical fibres, which was connected to the satellite dish at one end and the stables at the other. The cat hurried through the open door of the long, low building into the shadows, yowling. There was the sound of rain on the wooden roof, and the wind found its way through the open door in cold gusts. But it was dry in here, and the cat stopped and sat down on the concrete floor. Bare light bulbs hung down from the ceiling at intervals down the whole length of the narrow building, but only the one nearest the door was glowing. The cat licked at its wet fur and got to its feet, wandering further into the building. The stable had been converted into a large garage, housing half a dozen cars, 2 of them under paint-spattered sheets, a third one up on ramps with a plastic bowl full of sump-oil under it. The cat sniffed at the oily darkness under the car, then turned and walked back towards the door of the garage. It emerged from the shadows into the yellow gleam from the single naked bulb. Directly under the bulb was a big, oil-stained oak workbench. A small man was sitting on a chrome bar stool at the bench, watching television. The cat rubbed against the legs of the stool and purred. The television set was a 1940s Bakelite design, with a small, milky green screen. It was connected to a bundle of gaffer-taped cables that ran out the window and into the ground. The small man was leaning forward, elbows on the bench, watching the screen with concentration. Scattered along the bench between his elbows were vacuum tubes, clipped curves of copper wire, and a large black envelope. The monochrome image on the small screen was surprisingly sharp and clear. It showed a man, a woman, and a young boy sitting on a couch facing out at the viewer. The sound from the television was tinny but audible. "You better not have any more of that sour mash, Stephanie," the man was saying. "Not on an empty stomach. I'll fix you and Patrick some breakfast in a minute. How do waffles sound, Pat?" "Great, Dad," said the little boy, staring out at the TV screen, not looking up. Stephanie was finding herself wondering if television was actually good for children. It was the fixed, intense way that Patrick was staring. He sat beside her, watching the television, never looking away. It was as if there was someone out there on the other side of the screen, sitting and watching, looking back at Patrick. Stephanie shivered at the notion. She dismissed the thought. It was a beautiful morning with the sun coming up over the mountains, shining through the big picture window, breakfast smells drifting up from the kitchen. O'Hara came up the stairs with a pitcher of orange juice. He was wearing a chunky wool sweater, and Stephanie wondered about asking him if he had another one. She suddenly felt cold. "Waffles are on," he said. Stephanie looked up at him. "No one's going to stop us, are they?" "Who could stop us?" said O'Hara. The doctor leaned forward and switched off the small, old-fashioned television. Rain was drumming on the roof of the converted stables. The cat stirred restlessly, wandering among the cars while the doctor sat staring at the blank screen, elbows on the workbench. Then he reached down and picked up the black envelope. He turned it over and wrote on it with what looked like a fountain pen. The pale ink had a faint luminous glow. He wrote in big motions of the hand 3 letters. Ace.